Imagine living in a world where your forehead shape, your skin tone, and how much lice you had in your hair could determine your social status, your marriage prospects, or even whether people thought you were a good person. That was the bizarre, brutal, and strangely poetic world of medieval beauty. A time when appearance wasn't just about vanity, it was about survival, virtue, and faith, tangled together in a world ruled by superstition, hardship, and deeply entrenched class divides. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where beauty wasn't just in the eye of the beholder, it was a calculated display of power, discipline, suffering, and symbolic meaning, so layered that even the crudest rituals carried moral and spiritual weight. And in this video, we're going to peel back those layers to reveal what it truly meant to be beautiful in an age without mirrors, makeup tutorials, or modern medicine, where the price of beauty could be your health or your soul, and where what you looked like wasn't just how you were seen, but who you were deemed to be. Let's begin not with royalty or peasants, but with the one feature that crossed every social line: your skin, and what it said about your station in life and your worth as a human being. Because in medieval Europe, the ideal wasn't glowing sun-kissed skin or the bronzed body of a beachgoer. Instead, the most sought-after look was something we might now associate with illness, the ghostly pallor of someone who had never worked a day in their life under the sun. And that wasn't just coincidence. It was a badge of honor, a silent but powerful declaration that you were above manual labor, above the fields, above the peasants who toiled from dawn till dusk beneath the burning sky. Because to be pale was to be protected, preserved, and privileged. Noble women would go to unimaginable lengths to maintain this death-like complexion, avoiding sunlight like it was a curse, hiding under parasols, veils, wide-brimmed hats, or even locking themselves indoors during summer months, and in some cases, they wouldn't appear outside unless it was dawn or after nightfall, just to keep their faces untouched by even the faintest blush of real light, because the slightest hint of color could mark them as impure, less noble, or, God forbid, laboring. But they didn't stop at lifestyle, because where nature fell short, medieval cosmetics stepped in, and here's where things turned lethal. To achieve that sickly white perfection, women used face powders made from white leadius, the poisonous metal you're warned about today, the one that causes nerve damage, tremors, organ failure, and death, and they painted it right onto their faces, sometimes layer after layer, year after year, until their skin deteriorated, their hair fell out, and their bodies began to decay from the inside. A process so slow and so well documented that you wonder how they didn't stop. But they didn't, because being pale wasn't just attractive. It was social currency, and many women were literally dying to preserve it. Queen Elizabeth I of England, perhaps the most iconic example, wore so much white lead makeup by her later years that historical accounts describe it cracking like plaster when she smiled, her face a canvas of age, pain, and ambition masquerading as youth and grace. And here's where we have to pause, just to gasp at the insanity of smearing poison across one's face, but to consider the weight of beauty in a society where your looks didn't just open doors, they were your identity, your protection, and your potential, and to lose them could mean falling through the social cracks with no one there to catch you. And it wasn't only those who could afford lead who suffered; those lower down the hierarchy tried to imitate the look as best they could with flour, chalk, and rosewater-soaked breadcrumbs, even applying leeches to drain blood and create artificial paleness, because the appearance of nobility, even if fleeting, gave them a taste of something more than their station allowed. And that's a hunger more powerful than pain. So when we think of beauty routines today, face masks, serums, contour kits. It's almost laughable to compare them to a time when the very pursuit of aesthetic perfection was an act of self-harm, wrapped in silk and powdered wigs. But the motivations haven't changed as much as we'd like to believe. And if we look hard enough, maybe we'll see our own reflections in the ghostly white masks of medieval women who'd sacrificed their health for a fleeting sense of belonging, status, and safety. And while noble women were locked away in their shaded chambers, layering poison onto their cheeks in the name of elegance, a completely different kind of beauty was forming in the fields and villages just beyond the castle walls, because for medieval peasants, beauty wasn't about ethereal lightness or fragility, was about grit, resilience, and the kind of strength that didn't fade under the weight of real life. And if you think the phrase "strong is beautiful" is modern, you might be surprised to learn that it was the peasant class who first defined it, not with hashtags or fitness influencers, but with the sheer necessity of surviving every brutal winter, every failed harvest, and every aching morning of hard labor. Because among the working class, the most desirable partner wasn't the one with a porcelain face or soft hands. It was the one who could haul 2 buckets of water uphill without breaking stride, who could carry firewood, thresh wheat, and still have the energy to dance at the harvest festival. Because when food was scarce and every body counted, physical competence wasn't just attractive, which was essential. Men were prized for broad shoulders, powerful backs, and strong arms, all built not in gyms but in fields, barns, and blacksmith forges. And archaeological studies of medieval skeletons have revealed that the average peasant man had bones in his dominant arm that were denser and more developed than those of many modern professional athletes. A silent but unbreakable record of a lifetime spent swinging axes, guiding plows, and shaping iron. Women, too, were judged not by daintiness but by their ability to endure. The ideal village bride wasn't one with delicate features, but with firm hands, a straight back, and the muscle to help build a household from scratch. And courtship often resembled a silent job interview, with young men watching how a girl carried firewood, how she milked a cow, or how many steps she took before needing to stop for breath, and those calluses on her hands. Not flaws, but credentials, a resume, written in cracked skin and quiet endurance. Even literature of the time, from folk songs to rural poems, celebrated women who could hoist sacks of grain or manage livestock acts of labor as declarations of love and viability. Because the body wasn't just for looking at, it was for building a life, for protecting a family, for surviving the next storm or famine. And in that way, beauty for peasants was deeply egalitarian, rooted in what you could do, not just how you looked doing it. And yet, even among the peasants, there was a shadow of the nobility's ideals. The idea that on feast days or weddings, you might dust your face with flour, press flowers into your hair, or wear your nicest tunic just to catch someone's eye across the village square, because even the strongest among them wanted to feel seen, wanted to feel beautiful in a way that lifted them above their daily grind, even if just for one evening beneath the stars. But the stark difference here is that their beauty came not at the cost of health, but as a byproduct of survival. Their bodies bore the marks of their reality, and those marks were honored, not hidden. So while nobility painted lies on their faces, peasants wore truth in every scar, every line, every ache that reminded them they were still alive, still standing, and still capable of loving someone just as strong. And if strength was the language of beauty in the fields, then hair was the poetry that crossed every divide, noble or peasant, devout or vain, rich, or scraping by. Your hair told a story long before you ever opened your mouth, because, in the medieval world where mirrors were rare and art was mostly religious, hair became a personal and public symbol of health, identity, and moral character. And for women, in particular, it was everything: part crown, part canvas, part virtue, badge. And in many cases, the most visible way to be seen without saying a word. Long, thick, and lustrous hair was the ideal, so prized that unmarried girls often wore it down as a signal of their youth and availability, while married women were expected to keep theirs hidden under veils, hoods, or elaborate headdresses, not just for modesty, but to mark the passage into a different role, one where visibility meant something else entirely. And unlike pale skin or silken gowns, hair didn't require wealth to be beautiful. It required care, patience, and good health, which is why it became such a powerful symbol across class lines. Because if your hair was full and shiny, it meant you were nourished, vital, possibly even virtuous. And if it was dull, brittle, or thinning, people might assume you were ill, sinful, or aging. And that's not just superstition, that's how they read bodies, like texts written by God or nature, with every strand offering a clue to your deeper worth. Noble women had the luxury of time and servants to wash, detangle, and style their hair daily, using ivory or boxwood combs, not just for beauty, but for lice removal, a social grooming activity that doubled as bonding time and even flotation. Because yes, in a world where parasites were normal, having someone carefully comb through your hair could be oddly intimate, the medieval equivalent of Netflix and nitpick. They stored these combs in boxes decorated with gems or precious metals, passed down through generations like sacred heirlooms. Because hair wasn't just hair, was lineage, memory, and pride. And then there was the holy grail of hair color, blonde, rare, radiant, and deeply symbolic, associated with angels, purity, and the Virgin Mary, which meant noble women would go to bizarre and painful lengths to turn their hair golden, soaking it in saffron if they were rich, or horse urine if they were desperate, sometimes mixing in lye and then baking their heads under the sun until the scalp burned and the strands lightened, a practice so damaging that some women lost chunks of hair entirely, but considered it worth the pain, because the appearance of divinely inspired beauty trumped any physical consequence. And here's where the symbolism cuts deep, because they weren't doing this just to be admired, but to be sanctified, to align themselves with spiritual icons and embody a kind of otherworldly grace that elevated them above the earthbound, sweaty business of normal life. Peasants, meanwhile, might not have had saffron or ivory combs, but they had their own rituals, simple oils, woven garlands, or letting their hair grow long as a point of pride, because no matter the class, hair was the one canvas you could shape, flaunt, or shield, and in that sense, it gave women a strange kind of power in a world where most power was denied to them. And maybe that's why losing it tore, being forced to cover it carried such weight. Because it wasn't just a change in appearance, it was a shift in autonomy, a silencing of self-expression that ran deeper than cloth or fashion. In a society that worshipped icons but distrusted vanity, hair walked the line between sacred and seductive, between nature and control, between the soul and the body. And if you ever doubt how much that matters, just remember, even in death, many women were buried with their hair brushed out and braided, as if beauty could follow them into the next world. And if hair spoke of beauty and spirit, then skin screamed, whispered, pleaded, and betrayed, because in the medieval imagination, Your face was never just a face. It was a battlefield of invisible forces, a billboard advertising your soul, your diet, your mood, even your sins. And nowhere was this belief more deeply rooted than in the theory of the four humours, a cornerstone of medieval medicine that said your body was governed by blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black biland, that your skin showed the balance or imbalance of these fluids in real time. So if you had clear, luminous skin, people assumed your humours were in perfect harmony, meaning you were healthy, morally upright, emotionally stable, and maybe even favored by God. But if your face bore acne, blotches, rashes, or discoloration, the assumptions were swift and cruel. You were gluttonous, lustful, angry, dirty, sick, or spiritually tainted, and these weren't just passing judgments, they could determine your social fate, your marriage prospects, your ability to gain employment, or even your eligibility to join a religious order. Because if your face didn't match the ideal, your soul must be flawed too. And let's be clear, the ideal complexion wasn't extreme pallor or blushing heat, but something much harder to achieve, a gentle, balanced rosiness, like a flower on the verge of blooming, suggesting that you ate well, but not excessively, felt deeply but not too passionately, and remained spiritually attuned without arrogance or excess pride. Women were expected to walk this tightrope of visual perfection, their faces acting as emotional thermostats and moral mirrors. Where too much color meant you were impure or drunk or angry, and too little color meant you were sick, lazy, or possibly dying. And in a world where disease was rampant and medicine primitive, these snap judgments carried real weight, because beauty wasn't just decorative, it was diagnostic. This obsession with the balanced face led to strange skincare routines for those who could afford them: pastes made of crushed pearls, milk baths, vinegar scrubs, and herbal masks designed to draw out bad humors and restore purity to the skin. Not unlike modern detox trends, but with a dose of superstition and far less hygiene. And for those who couldn't afford such luxuries, the sun was enemy number one, and facial damage from the elements wasn't just unpleasant, it was socially disqualifying. Some used veils not only for modesty, but as shields against dust and disease, because even a windburned cheek could tell the wrong story. And this is where the cruelty cuts in, because imagine being a teenage girl with hormonal acne in a world that thinks your spots are evidence of sin or emotional instability. A world that treats your skin as a confession you never meant to give. And unlike now, there were no dermatologists, no concealer, no way to opt out of being judged by your face. It was public property, constantly interpreted by strangers, priests, and potential suitors. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the toxicity of many beauty rituals, there was a deeper longing behind all of it, a longing to be seen as whole, as good, as in control of something in a world where so much felt chaotic and fragile. And perhaps that's the most human part of it all. Beneath the powders and poultices and paranoid grooming routines, there was the simple, aching desire to be looked at with kindness, to be seen not as a threat or a warning sign, but as someone balanced, beautiful, and worthy of love. And just when you think it couldn't get stranger, medieval beauty took a sharp left turn into the realm of physical form, body shape, size, proportions. If you assume the ideal woman was expected to be slender and waif-like, think again. Because, in the Middle Ages, thinness wasn't a beauty standard, it was a red flag, a potential sign that you were sick, starving, or simply too poor to eat regularly. And in a world where famine was more common than fashion, curves were currency, softness was survival, and fullness was a visible sign that your family had food. that your body could bear children, and that you weren't one bad winter away from collapsing in the fields. Look at medieval art, Virgin Maries, noble women, even mythological goddesses, and you'll find round bellies, broad hips, and generous busts painted with reverence, not ridicule. And this wasn't just artistic stylization, it was a reflection of real cultural values. Beauty meant bounty, and bounty meant security. In fact, slightly protruding stomachs were so admired that dresses were designed to accentuate them, with high waistlines that pushed fabric out over the belly to create a silhouette that said, "I am fertile, I am healthy, and I've eaten today." Now contrast that with today's obsession with flat stomachs and calorie counting, and the irony becomes painful, because back then, women were literally encouraged to look like they could carry a child and a roast dinner at the same time, whereas now we Photoshop away the very things that once meant life and desirability. But it wasn't just about food or fertility, it was about resisting the instability of the world around you. Having a fuller body meant you could survive a bout of illness, a few missed meals, or a rough pregnancy, and that made you valuable, not only to suitors, but to the community. The poor, of course, didn't always have the luxury of curves, but they still idolized them in stories, tapestries, and tales told over shared loaves of bread, where the beautiful maiden wasn't the thinnest or the youngest, but the one who glowed with health and promise. And here's where the medieval mindset holds up a cracked mirror to our modern one, because what we now define as discipline, refusing food, maintaining a gym body, counting macros, would have looked like madness or misery to people whose daily lives were dominated by hunger and disease. So while today's influencers chase abs and thigh gaps, medieval women pushed their bellies out to suggest abundance and potential, using fashion to highlight what we now try to hide, and in doing so, they embraced a different kind of power, the power to nourish, to sustain, to endure. And perhaps the most telling thing is this: the beauty ideals of that time didn't celebrate fragility or self-denial. They celebrated the ability to give life, to hold life, and to survive what life threw at you. And maybe, just maybe, that's a standard worth revisiting, not in shape, but in spirit. And if you thought high cheekbones were a sign of sophistication, wait until you hear what medieval nobility coveted most, because among the strangest, most obsessive beauty trends of the era was the pursuit of the impossibly high forehead, not as a medical condition or a genetic quirk, but as an intentional, excruciating fashion statement that required women to pluck, scrape, and sometimes even chemically burn away their natural hairlines until their scalps looked more like polished domes than living skin. And while that might sound grotesque today, back then it was considered the pinnacle of elegance, intelligence, and aristocratic refinement, because the higher your forehead, the more noble and contemplative you were presumed to be, as if your brain needed literal room to grow. And this wasn't just a light grooming adjustment, it was a transformation that involved months, even years, of painful upkeep, using metal tweezers, wax made from resin or pitch, harsh herbal concoctions, and in some cases, yes, even smearing cat feces on the scalp because it was believed to prevent hair regrowth, an olfactory nightmare in the name of sophistication. And the result? Portraits from the 14th and 15th centuries, where women's foreheads stretch up so far they seem alien, occupying nearly a third of the face, making them look serene, statuesque, and completely detached from the dirt and heat of daily life, which was precisely the point, because in a world obsessed with hierarchy, anything that made you appear less physical, less grounded, more ethereal, and removed, made you more desirable. It's a bit like today's digital filters erasing flaws, reshaping features, all in the name of appearing better, even if the result looks nothing like your real self. And that's the tragic thread connecting then and now. The more unattainable the beauty standard, the more powerful the people who meet it appear. But here's the gut punch. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about submission. Because who else but women were asked to mutilate their own bodies in the name of cultural expectation, to undergo daily pain for the illusion of effortlessness, to mark themselves as desirable not through joy but through sacrifice. And the saddest part, many of them believed it was worth it, that to bear the scars of plucking and the sting of chemical burns was a small price for admiration, protection, or marriage. And perhaps this is the most haunting echo of all, the idea that the path to being loved, noticed, or respected must pass through pain. That beauty is something to be earned through suffering, not celebrated through natural presence. And we may laugh now at receding hairlines drawn higher on purpose. But do we not inject, carve, lift, bleach, and digitally alter ourselves today in pursuit of standards just as arbitrary, just as cruel? The tools have changed, but the hunger for validation, for worth, for the gaze that says you matter, remains devastatingly the same. And now we arrive at the mouth, that humble gatekeeper of voice, nourishment, and in medieval times, sensual implication and moral suspicion alike. Because while dentistry as we know it barely existed and toothpaste was a concept centuries away, the state of your teeth still carried deep social and aesthetic significance. And though the standards were modest by modern expectations, they were no less revealing of how beauty operated in a world straddling superstition and scarcity. You see, in a society where most people had lost at least a few teeth by their mid-30s, thanks to decay, malnutrition, and the lack of anything remotely resembling dental hygiene, just having your original set of teeth was something close to miraculous, and even more so if they were reasonably straight, not blackened, and not overly chipped from years of chewing hard bread or using your mouth as a third hand. But even among these lowered expectations, one feature stood out as oddly prized: a small gap between the front teeth, affectionately called the lover's window or the door of paradise. And it wasn't seen as a flaw, it was celebrated, romanticized, woven into poems and love songs as a sign of passion, openness, and sensuality, as if this tiny imperfection hinted at a larger generosity of spirit and affection. Some people even filed their teeth to create that gap artificially, an early and agonizing version of cosmetic dentistry done without anesthesia, steel tools, or professional guidance, which should tell you everything about the lengths people were willing to go for beauty, even if it meant literal blood in their mouths. And it wasn't just the look of teeth that mattered, it was the scent, the breath, the implication of bodily decay versus cleanliness. Because without deodorant, breath mints, or regular bathing, one's scent was part of their presence, and if your breath was foul, it didn't just mean you'd eaten onions, it could be taken as a sign of spiritual rot, gluttony, or even demonic influence. Remedies for bad breath ranged from herbal rinses to chewing spices like cloves or fennel seeds. And while noble folk might have access to these luxuries, the average peasant had to hope that drinking ale and avoiding dried fish would be enough to stay on someone's good side, literally. And again, here we see the paradox. In a time where few had the tools to maintain oral health, people still believed that teeth could reflect inner worth, that something as invisible as a molar could affect how God or a suitor judged your character. And maybe what this really reveals is how deeply we've always feared the body's natural entropy. How much we cling to the illusion of control through grooming, rituals, or selective attention, and how often we tie our value not to who we are, but to how successfully we can mask our inevitable decay. Because in the end, whether you're brushing with fluoride or rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, the impulse is the same: to keep smiling even when it hurts, and to hope that someone sees your imperfect teeth not as ruin, but as beauty filtered through survival. And if teeth whispered secrets about desire and decay, then sent yes, your literal body odor shouted truths too intimate to hide, because in the medieval world, how you smelled wasn't just about hygiene or attraction, it was a full-bodied declaration of your health, your habits, your station, and even your soul. And contrary to popular myth, medieval people didn't simply accept filth as the norm or wander around reeking of rot and dung. In fact, they cared deeply about smell, but in ways shaped by limited water access, religious doctrine, and community proximity. Because when your world is no larger than your village, and everyone knows everyone else's breath and sweat patterns by heart, being the one who stinks could be a lifelong social sentence. Bathhouses did exist, and were often surprisingly communal places, not just for cleaning, but for gossip, romance, and even low-level scandal. But when the plague arrived, those bathhouses became suspect, feared as breeding grounds for disease, and slowly fell out of favor in many areas, leaving people to resort to more localized cleaning practices, washing hands, faces, and unmentionable parts with basins of water, sometimes infused with herbs or vinegar, while full-body immersion became infrequent events reserved for holidays, illnesses, or rich folks with access to heated tubs and indoor privacy. And yet, despite bathing less often than we do now, medieval people were incredibly resourceful in managing body odor. They layered linen undergarments beneath wool or silk, so they could swap out and wash the linen more easily. They rubbed rosemary sprigs or lavender into their skin, chewed parsley for breath, and sewed sweet-smelling sachets into their clothing. All a strategic olfactory camouflage that turned everyday hygiene into a kind of personal alchemy. And here's the curious beauty of it. These rituals weren't seen as vanity, but virtue. Smelling pleasant was considered a sign of inner balance, moral uprightness, even spiritual grace, because stench was linked to sin, rot, corruption of both flesh and soul, and if you smelled like compost, it meant something in you had gone wrong, not just physically but cosmically. This was especially true for women, who were expected to carry the scent of purity like an invisible aurith. A woman's breath or garments hinted at musk, smoke, or sweat. It could undermine her reputation faster than a false accusation, while a scent of rosewater or clove was like a whispered prayer of grace. For noble women, maintaining that scented image was part of their daily discipline. Servants would perfume their combs, lace their garments with crushed blossoms, and sometimes even sprinkle powdered herbs onto their bedding so their bodies would carry the memory of sweetness long after the flowers had wilted. And yet, for all this effort, there remained a tension. Beauty was sacred, but excess grooming could be seen as vanity, even sin. So women learned to strike a careful balance: fragrant, but not indulgent, clean but not provocative, noticeable but never boastful. And perhaps this is where the real burden of medieval beauty shows itself, not just in the tools or the treatments, but in the constant emotional labor of being pleasing, appropriate, and invisible all at once, a walking contradiction that carried the weight of desire and damnation in every inch of exposed flesh and every whiff of their perfume. And after the perfumes have faded, after the powders have settled, what remains is something we rarely consider beautiful today: conduct, composure, the choreography of everyday virtue, because in medieval society, beauty was not confined to bone structure or body shape. It extended into how you behaved, how softly you spoke, how gracefully you moved, and how devoutly you performed your role, especially if you were a woman. And this meant that true attractiveness was often a blend of flesh and script. Your appearance judged not only by how you looked, but by how well you followed a performance that had been written for you centuries before you were born. Noble girls were trained from childhood in the delicate arts of restraint and reverence, taught to glide rather than walk, to bow rather than greet, to smile without revealing teeth, and to lower their eyes in the presence of men as a sign of both humility and self-control, and every movement was monitored, every slip catalogued. Speak too loudly, laugh too freely, or forget to keep your hands folded demurely at your waist, and your beauty, no matter how symmetrical your face, could be deemed vulgar or corrupt. These expectations were etched into conduct books, passed from mother to daughter like holy relics, filled with commands like walk with small steps, do not eat with enthusiasm, and avoid being seen too much. Because invisibility, ironically, was often the ultimate mark of grace. And what makes this all the more tragic is that these behaviors were praised as natural, even though they were carefully rehearsed. Femininity was a performance of quiet suffering, where the most beautiful women were often those who seemed to disappear just enough to be admired but never enough to be heard. And the line between elegance and erasure was thin as the silk veils they wore. Even more telling was how deeply these standards were embedded in religious virtue. Modesty, silence, obedience, and piety were not only admired, they were divine mandates, and so beauty became a sacred duty, a way to prove one's moral worth, through posture, volume, and clothing. And for peasant women, the standards were looser in form, but just as strict in spirit. They were expected to be strong yet not brash, loyal yet not outspoken, skilled yet not proud, and any woman who stepped outside the bounds of humility was at risk of being labeled dangerous, tempting, or worse, witch-like. This unrelenting pressure created a paradox where women had to constantly present themselves as both desirable and passive, visible and chaste, useful and compliant, an exhausting balance that left little room for joy, expression, or rebellion. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is how often women internalized this code, believing that to be beautiful meant to be silent, to be still, to erase their presence into palatable outlines others could admire without being challenged. So if today's beauty standards demand thinness, youth, or filters, the medieval ones demanded erasure, obedience, and the sublimation of personality into gesturant. If you think that's a relic of the past, ask yourself how many times modern women still feel the need to shrink, apologize, or soften their voices just to be considered worthy of the room they're in. And if behavior was beauty's moral compass, then religious expression was its sacred crown. Because in a world where the church wasn't just an institution but the rhythm of daily life, looking holy was more than respectably, was irresistibly beautiful, especially for women, whose appearance was judged as much by its modesty as by its radiance. And while today we might separate spirituality from style, in the Middle Ages they were fused, stitched into every hemline, every lowered gaze, every choice to cover or reveal. Women didn't just dress for the weather or the season, they dressed for the soul, for the eyes of their priest, their neighbors, and their God. And nowhere was this more visible than in the careful curation of church attire. Subdued colors like deep blues, soft whites and grays were favored, echoing the imagery of the Virgin Mary, while garish reds or golds, especially during Lent or Advent, could draw rebuke from both peers and the pulpit, because beauty in these contexts was a form of reverence, not self-celebration, and anything that looked like vanity, even something as small as a decorative ribbon, could be seen as blasphemy. In fact, historical records show women saving for years just to afford a single church dress, something they would wear only on high holy days, tend with loving care, and pass down through generations as both a garment and a testimony to their devotion. And it wasn't just clothing. Hair had to be covered entirely in church. Symbols of faith like rosaries and cross pendants were worn not as accessories but as signals of purity, and faces were expected to remain neutral, calm, sereni, no hushi, no perfumi, no flirtation, just the quiet mask of the devout. And here's where the medieval tension sharpens to a knife's edge, because women were still expected to be beautiful. But now it was a specific kind of beauty, humble, holy, and unthreatening aesthetic restraint wrapped in spiritual performance. A look that whispered, "I am good," without needing to speak. And yet, this standard was as punishing as any other, because how does one cultivate humility while also striving to be seen? How do you maintain reverence without completely erasing your own presence? And for women caught between wanting to be noticed and fearing to be noticed too much, this dance was exhausting, even worse. The church itself often fed this paradox-breaching modesty while commissioning art filled with idealized female saints. Glowing with virtue and light, their physical forms celebrated even as real women were told to hide theirs. So beauty was always framed as sacred, but only when safely fictionalized, never when living and breathing in the pews beside you. And perhaps that's the most insidious beauty standard of all, the one that praises you only when you disappear into archetype, that reveres your image while demanding your silence, and that calls your presence divine only when it's filtered through someone else's design. And as we close the chapel doors and step back into the muddy streets of daily life, it becomes clear that medieval beauty was never just a set of physical traits, was a system, a map, a contract written between body and belief, between survival and spectacle, and nowhere is that more apparent than in how people, especially women, internalize these standards, not just as social norms but as personal truths. Because in an age without mass media, without Photoshop, without TikTok filters, the pressure to be beautiful still seeped into every crevice of life, not because anyone handed out magazines or shouted trends from rooftops, but because your appearance was tied to your morality, your class, your marriageability, even your salvation. And that made beauty a form of currency more powerful than gold. The noble woman, imprisoned by velvet drapes and white-led dreams, destroyed her health in pursuit of elegance, believing that to decay gracefully was more honorable than to age honestly. The peasant girl, barefoot in the fields, learned to measure her worth not in waist size or facial symmetry, but in how much she could carry, how long she could endure, and how quietly she could bleed without complaint. The unmarried maiden was her hair, her walk, her hands. The married woman was her silence, her smell, her knees bent before both altar and husband. And through it all, beauty remained both a promise and a punishment, offering brief moments of power, attention, or protection, only to demand suffering. In return, whether through plucking, starving, hiding, smiling, or enduring in silence. And this is what makes medieval beauty so haunting. Not the weirdness of the trends, though cat poop forehead, creams and leech facials certainly make the list, but the way every woman had to constantly negotiate her own body in order to be safe, seen, or spared from judgment. And while it's tempting to laugh at how extreme it all seems now, the real horror is realizing how many of these patterns still echo through time. We still lighten our skin, though with serums instead of lead. We still reshape our features, though with injections instead of tweezers. We still equate beauty with virtue, with success, with attention, even as we pretend we've moved on. The tools have changed, the language has softened, but the stakes especially. For women are often the same: look right or pay the price. And perhaps that's why studying medieval beauty matters, not because we want to copy it or mock it, but because by understanding its logic, its cruelty, and its desperate tenderness, we begin to see the scaffolding beneath our own standards. And maybe, just maybe, in that realization, there's space to build something better. Medieval beauty wasn't about looking good. It was about surviving, belonging, and performing virtue under a punishing gaze. And though the aesthetics have changed, the pressure to conform a fond at the cost of health, joy, or truth remains. By learning how beauty was weaponized in the past, we gain the clarity and courage to challenge the ideals we're handed today and, maybe even redefine beauty on our own terms.